What is up, Hot Take Nation? It is DRW here for another episode of the Hot Take of the Day podcast, where we touch on all the topics that you're dying to talk about, but are afraid that your boss might fire you for. So today we have Tisha Schuler is with us, and she's built quite a reputation as a fireball in the industry of late. And so I'm very happy to have you on the show. Tisha, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So for the listeners who don't know you and what you're up to these days, why don't you take a couple minutes and walk people through your background and your mandate and what you're trying to accomplish these days?
Sure. Today, I run Adamantine Energy, and that's a company I founded 5 years ago to focus on future-proofing the oil and gas industry against rising social risk. Before that, I ran the Colorado Oil and Gas Association for 5.5 years during really dramatic rise in opposition and totally changing demographics in Colorado that made life in Colorado very challenging for oil and gas producers. And then before that, I was an environmental consultant who was skeptical of the oil and gas industry. And before that, I was an environmental activist that was just straight up opposed to the oil and gas industry.
You've had quite a journey to come onto our side of the table. We need more people like you.
You know, I hear that, and yet it is challenging because I hold all these perspectives in my psyche at the same time. I live in a log cabin built in 1873. I bake bread. I'm like half hippie, half oil and gas passionate advocate.
So the quarantine must be going quite well for you. If you live in a log cabin and you make your own bread, I mean, I feel like right now, if odds were going somewhere, your chances of survival in the zombie apocalypse are much higher than mine.
Very high. Our masks are camo. My boys hunt. We will not go hungry. And our biggest risk is I have 13 and 16-year-old boys is that they will just finally rebel against having to live with their parents 24/7.
Yeah, I could see that. Now, before we got on the air, you were talking about one of your son for the year-end hockey party may have done a pre-work mullet, the little hockey hair, and that with the lack of barber is not aging particularly well. Want to walk us through what do they call it? A party. Business in the front, party in the rear.
Party in the back.
Oh, that's the good stuff right there. I got a mullet going a little bit too. You can't see it, but I think I might just grow my hair until unemployment's below 5%. So I'm gonna look like Tom Hanks in Castaway, or his role in Forrest Gump where he just ran until like the economy got better. That might be my new thing.
You'll be relieved to know that I did invest in mail order clippers. But at the same time, I was encouraging my boys, they need some form of rebellion. So I'm like, let's just double down on the mullet situation. Like it could be halfway down your back before you need to entertain girls again, up close. So, but my son, the 16-year-old, he found his own way. So the first thing he did was grab the clippers and notched his eyebrows.
Oh.
So I didn't even know that was a thing, but there's a lot of new things we learn in quarantine with our children.
It is interesting. I mean, I will say like that is the best part of quarantine. There's a lot of bad parts, but I do feel very fortunate that the family unit's together, and we get to spend a lot of time together normally. This is just amping it up, and it's always going to be a memory that we talk about in the future. So let's go ahead.
I was just going to tell you, I particularly appreciate it. During the Colorado floods in 2013, I was separated from my family, and having a crisis where you can't be with your family and you have no communication will set me up for actually the joy of having a little too much togetherness, but appreciating it for the blessing that it is.
Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. You talked about where you started as an environmental activist. And, I want to talk a little bit about just activism in general, because I think that we're seeing, and you live on the front line of this every day in oil and gas, but clearly the COVID-19, even the name of it is causing so much crisis, because is it the Wu flu? It's the Chinese virus, it's the Chinese Communist Party virus. I mean, there's so much political rhetoric even just around the name, because it seems to carry with it an agenda. And so as an activist at the beginning of your career, walk me through like the organization of activism and how you would rally people to a cause, go to a rally, do the things and push an agenda, and tie it into what we're seeing right now with the Wu flu.
Yeah, I will give you that with the caveat that I am also allergic to activism. So when I ran the Colorado Oil and Gas Association, my family was targeted by activists. So it's ironic to have what you feel like are your own people target your children. And so I live with this funny shared understanding that activists wake up every morning feeling they are on the side of right, like all of us.
Right.
And so they do believe they are doing the work that is required. And interestingly, a lot of activists also feel like they're counterculture or in some way opposing the norm.
Right, sticking it to the man.
Yeah, and it's funny because I live in Boulder County, one of the wealthiest counties in Colorado, and there's this sense of we're fighting the norm, and in reality, it's actually become a very just socially being opposed to oil and gas in all its forms is just totally socially acceptable. And in fact, you have to be very brave to take on a different perspective.
Yeah.
So one of the things I think that has changed, if you're a student at CU Boulder, it's so easy to protest in favor of climate. That is just a straightforward right thing to do. It's not particularly brave. But people feel that they are being brave and they are rebelling and they are engaging in something. And what I try to connect to is that sense of right. So that instead of being dismissive, which I, like a lot of people in the industry, want to just be dismissive or put motives on it like they're getting paid to do this, I think it's actually more constructive to think of activists as people who wake up in the morning, feel like they're on the side of right, feel like they're rebelling against capitalism or the man, and then understanding from that perspective, now what do we have to work with there? What are they trying to accomplish and what are we trying to work with? So I try to cultivate in myself a deep respect for that perspective, where in reality, I have a deeper respect. There's a movement at CU Boulder that's nonpartisan climate action, and they get just pilloried by the straight up left climate movement for reaching out to conservatives, for reaching out to companies. But that actually takes a lot of bravery. And so there's even activism in that middle space. And those are folks that wake up thinking they're on the side of right, and they are actually working counterculture and require a lot of bravery. And the last thing I'll say about activism, and our folks contend to this too, is that negative, it's much easier to mobilize with fear.
Yes, that much is clear.
Yeah, and at the same time, it's totally ineffective in encouraging mainstream action. So a huge failure of the climate movement is the apocalyptic thinking, which makes for great rallies, but makes for no action. So I have both an understanding and appreciation for what activism is trying to do, but I have some pretty strong critiques about how it's more focused on the fight than constructive action.
The contextualization of that, I think, is so interesting because yeah, like a good debate, but you know the way you talked about the mobilization using fear, and then the lack of what I've been finding really interesting, just as an aside, is that it seems like emotion leads all discussion, and data is not. People focus very little on data. And so like I compared the climate change discussion, which was, in my opinion, dominating and increasingly dominating the news leading into COVID. And to me, there's a very small link between the media mainstream media being primarily left wing. And I saw a meme that was something along the lines of, the left wing doesn't trust billionaires and corporations, but they trust the media organizations that are owned by billionaires and corporations. I thought that was really interesting. But like CNN, as an example, was really pushing a climate change narrative, climate change talking, climate change, and never really data. And they immediately shifted to the same narrative. And the net result has been a decrease of the use in fossil fuels. And so I do wonder about the linkage and the agenda. To your point, the activists themselves don't wake up in the morning and say, hey, who's paying me? but the people mobilizing those people are figuring out how to mobilize their agenda. And it does feel to me, without being a conspiracy theorist, that the climate change connection and the COVID connection have had the same net result.
Mm. That's interesting. I don't see that the same way. The way I think about climate pre-pandemic, and I don't know what climate was like post-pandemic, but we have good indicators along the way we can talk about. But pre-pandemic, this was closer, the discussion of climate was closer to a religious discussion that everyone would loosely try to base on their own scientific perspective, with only 15 people in the world actually looking at science and talking about science in a meaningful way. And I actually think it's more relevant to understand climate in that context, because we keep having conversations about science that are complete BS, when really what we should be saying is, would you take Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, even though that's not your religion? We would never do that.
Right.
If we approach climate from two points that I think are more constructive. One is just social risk. What does polling tell us about what people care about? What activism has as concrete threats? That's one way to approach it. And the other is, your worldview means you feel this way about climate. My worldview means I feel this way. What can we agree upon? And we know it's easy to find bridges around air pollution, around prosperity,
Right.
around caring for the least among us. We know how to do that. But we would keep having this fake science conversation that I think doesn't address the real issue.
I think that's an excellent point.
To the COVID thing, I don't know where COVID goes yet. I'm actually watching with real interest how it's becoming a partisan. You're having these partisan lines, and there's this kind of the same fake science and data, whereas a really interesting conversation, and I know you care about this and I care about it too, is just trade-offs. Straight up economic trade-offs, health trade-offs, let's be honest. And the trade-off conversation now is just getting consumed in this partisan identity that looks more like religion. And we're pretending we're talking about trade-offs, like, you don't care about my grandma, well, you don't care about my job. That's all BS. We should just own up that we're jumping into our political identities. We're taking our approach based on whichever that identity is. And that is preventing us from having the conversations we have to be having for the next 8 weeks, which is, what are the trade-offs? How are we going to get back to work?
Right.
And how much risk are we willing to take? And who's going to take responsibility for the downside?
Yes. I mean, great. I mean, you're just going to co-host the show from now on. I think everyone will be like, thank God there's finally someone talking like some logic. But okay, so if we jump forward to now, your move from activist on the environmental side to seeing what oil and gas is, and I do think Colorado has been a leader, at least in my opinion, in terms of the discussion of trade-offs. And we don't like the yellow smog over the city. We know that methane emissions are not a great thing. What are the things that we can do as an industry and as a regulatory body to change those things to make development better, safer, and provide clean energy? How do you reconcile the social license to operate the way it was 5 years ago, the way it is today, and some of the changes that you've seen in the context of why aren't the environmentalists celebrating some of the changes? And to the trade-offs, understanding that, like, right now, yes, there's no pollution and no consumption of fossil fuels, but the economy is literally at a dead stop, and we are risking the largest depression in the history of the universe, which will kill the billions of people they're trying to protect the planet for. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, so it's no secret for anyone that knows me that I think Colorado has gone too far in opposing oil and gas development, and that said, I think it is inevitable that Colorado will continue to go too far. So the paradigm that I switched to, I used to really be passionate about mobilizing the industry to advocate on behalf of the industry. That is still absolutely critical to our ongoing success, but it is no longer sufficient. And the reason I think that is because oil and gas, among other things, has become totally partisanized. And demographics in Colorado mean that we probably are just going to get bluer and bluer unless there's, maybe something like this will really shake up politics as we know it. But pre-pandemic, we could say Colorado's going to get bluer and bluer. Democrats are getting increasingly opposed to oil and gas. So what is an oil and gas company in Colorado to do? I think it's shift the paradigm. And the way that I focus on that for companies, and this was a change for me in 2019 from let's educate the people to let's lead to the energy future. And that is a result of what I think are social risks that we can't talk our way out of anymore. And it goes back to this idea of identity, religious-like affiliation with our feelings about the energy future. And that the only remedy for that is for companies to say, okay, you want an energy future? We're going to co-create it with you. I will say, in addition to all that, I think there is a role for oil and gas in perpetuity. I don't think the future happens without oil and gas. So this isn't me saying, let's construct our own demise.
Right.
This is me saying, how do we build an audience that can hear us and not dismiss everything we say because we're oil and gas industry defending our own interests and market share?
Well, it is really interesting because, and again, there is a pre-pandemic and a post-pandemic world. And, I have certainly said, and I use the example of Aubrey McClendon when he was campaigning for natural gas, which was underutilized at the expense of building coal-fired generation, using CO2 as the red herring, the religious experience was we're saving the climate, but really it was about demand. I've taken the same view that the wind and solar and renewables saw a $1 trillion marketplace that needed to be fed energy, and that the best way for them to gain power, and by power I mean capital, was at the expense of natural gas and oil as a transportation fuel. If you mobilize society against how evil that is, then the capital will go to replacing the infrastructure that already exists at a very cost economic way. And so, was Greta grassroots? Yeah, Greta was, arguing climate change and protesting school, but some man behind the curtains, woman behind the curtains most likely, sort of identified her and the power of a young girl that it would be really hard to attack, because we in our life we attack the person, not the idea, is what I've seen in media, and I didn't understand that until I started getting attacked. No one ever attacks my math or my ideas. They always attack me. So I thought about Greta as being perfect, because who's going to attack a 15-year-old girl and look bad? So they mobilized her, got her on TV, went around. She was the face of the whole thing. But it was about green investment, and it was being funded for green investment. And now the pandemic means that we don't actually need any more electricity if we go into a depression. We don't grow. And therefore, the business model isn't going to be we should switch out of natural gas to wind or to solar. It's going to be well, this is what we got, kids. We don't need any more energy for 10 years. We got to be economic. We need jobs, whatever goes. It's kind of an interesting point. What do you make of that?
So I don't know that I find the mobilizing force behind a green movement to be economics fundamentally about making money, but I do think it all works because of money behind things. And I'm fine with that because I'm a rabid capitalist. And I won't say I'm a passionately free market or bust, because everything we're seeing today is about how government intervention have a time and a place, depending on how you interpret that. What I do think is interesting, though, that's happening right now is the pressure. And I think we've seen 14 European governments saying their economic stimulus will be focused on clean energy. So there's a wrapping of this narrative into economic stimulus. And we're going to see, even in the US, it's going to be very difficult to have economic support that any other industry would get for the oil and gas industry. Now, the way I look at this isn't necessarily around who's the Oz behind the curtain, but what are the social risk forces at play, and have they reached a tipping point? And pre-pandemic, there was the likelihood that in North America, a very small majority, but a relevant number of people had tipped to saying we don't need oil and gas anymore because they don't understand the fundamentals of it, and it was an easy identity play, particularly in economically and intellectually relevant circles. Now, what does the pandemic offer us to switch that? Industry wants to do something that I don't think is going to be effective, which is, hey, you need us more than ever. The hospitals wouldn't run. The economy wouldn't get started.
Yeah, that narrative falls on flat in its face. It's true, but that's not mobilized. It's not like we can tell people more.
It's 100% true that it is absolutely true. The world ends without petroleum. Healthcare ends without petroleum. And it just looks retrograde and defensive. I do think there is a transcendent opportunity to say, we are your civic leaders. We are your responders. We are the ones who will lead the recovery. We are the ones who will lead the rebuild in new ways that we are imagining together. I don't think any other industry has the scale, the resources, the creativity, the millennial workforce that can make this happen. To do that, we have to be really careful about anything that looks like we're fighting for the old market share, because we can't simultaneously reinvent the future and fight for the past. So that's a framing that I think is really important right now. And what I want to see is the industry I knew in Colorado when we recovered from the 2013 floods, who said, yeah, we have every well in Colorado is underwater, and we are mobilizing people in trucks. We've mobilized $2.3 million. Like, we are at the forefront of recovery. And then ultimately rebuilding. That's what I want to see out of this moment from the industry.
Do you think, because the industry, again, it's such a complex issue, right? And like everything, somehow we turn on the TV and some doctor speaks for 30 seconds and we're like, okay, we have the answer. But we all know in our normal life, like, even what are we going to have for dinner is a more nuanced conversation than like everything we're seeing on television. And so, as you know, having seen my work for the last 18 months, the narrative that I was pushing, and it wasn't even a narrative, it was to me a data-driven analysis. And my analysis was, number one, the world didn't need more oil, fact. Number two, balance sheets, we were trying to grow our way out of debt, which will be a good conversation for government in the future. And so we had to grow production and grow rigs to grow our way out of debt, which wasn't possible. And three, inventory in actual fact was declining, becoming less good. And in November of 2019, we actually hit peak oil USA. So the most oil the US will ever produce. And this was 4 months pre-COVID, I'll say. November 2019 exhibited a decline because the quality of inventory was declining. And so the reason I put all this out there is so industry wants to be part of leading, but we aren't a growth engine anymore. We are very clearly at the whims of supply demand. And the core reality is Russia and Saudi can make oil for cheaper than the US. And we are now so very clearly the marginal barrel that the world doesn't need and shouldn't invest in, because now for an American, this is not good for energy security, which is a different conversation. But like, a investor should be investing in Saudi and in Russia because those barrels are cheaper and they have more resiliency to withstand what's happening today. So how does the industry, given that the entire oil investment thesis is dead for the foreseeable future, participate in a recovery as a leading resource allocator, I guess?
So what I would say as a paradigm for thinking about this is 150 years of entrepreneurial spirit. So I could not agree with you more that every bit of thinking that got us here is now antiquated and largely irrelevant. And yet, as most of our industry leaders, not all, there's some really interesting exceptions, but as a lot of industry leaders are talking about, it's this you need us, and it's like a return to business as usual. So I do think that the kind of entrepreneurial spirit that every time there's a pivot that requires the next level of innovation and efficiency, companies know how to do that. That is what has to be brought to this moment. And I do think post-COVID, we will have a re-understanding of energy as we know it. we were moving in this direction anyway, just, Uber versus public transportation.
Absolutely.
Now, how we travel, how we work, all of these things, we will think of energy differently. It will still be invisible, it will still be practically free, and it will still be always there for the average person in the public. But who articulates what that looks like and what our role is? So there, of course, is going to be massive consolidation of the industry. And I think the winners aren't the ones that cut the most capital, but those that actually just repositioned for a post-COVID energy world.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's super succinct, and I agree that it's, and I've taken a lot of flack online for my defense of Vicky Holub. And I will stand by what I say about her always, because again, like the shorts are super excited that they've all made a whole bunch of money because oil is like negative $37 a barrel. And so yes, they may have been right on the shale and a whole bunch of other some core issues, but like it was exacerbated by a black swan. And so like blaming the CEO, Vicky in particular, who, as I thought about like women leaders I really respect in industry, there weren't a lot because there's so few. And so it was interesting, and I disagreed with the article that said, if she was a man, would she have been given such a hard time? But man or woman, she is unique in that she is the only one. And, people forget that Chevron bid for it and would have taken it. People forget that, and I was positioned for oil was going to be $60 this year because the US was declining and people were spending less money and restoring their balance sheet. And a $60 oil makes all these companies massively different and they consolidate. And then everyone's celebrating. See, look how bad she is. But Matt Gallagher merged with Jagged Peak, and Joe Grotto of Callan, instead of selling, merged with, no one's talking about these leaders, and yet she's being identified. But I think what Oxy's business model is, and the way that she thinks through problems, and the CO2 plan, and the way that she leads that organization, she is a model leader and got caught with a bad decision based on a black swan event. So interesting. I said a lot there, but what do you think about that?
So, David, we're going to have to work harder to find things we disagree on, because I am Vicky Holub's second greatest fan after you, for a number of reasons, but one of which is Oxy Low Carbon Ventures and the way she has articulated a moral obligation to participate in climate change in her meeting with the Pope, which is embracing this religious-like narrative and saying, like a literally religious narrative. She was with the Pope saying this.
Right.
And then articulating that not only will we produce the last barrel, but it will be net carbon negative, which is aspirational, which we have to share the aspirations of the public. And she went a step that I wouldn't go, but I think it was genius given her very vulnerable situation as the only high-profile CEO of an oil and gas company, which is, she said, we're not going to stray from our core business. We're going to be oil and gas. She's not saying, well, I'm investing in renewables and electric charging stations like the international oil and gas majors is. She says we're going to be the best at this, and creating what I think is an awesome conundrum, which is if you prioritize climate change as your number one issue, you have to support a net carbon negative oil. Or someone like you or me is going to win debates with you all day long because you're more interested in vilifying a fuel that's made out of carbon than you are about addressing the issue that you care about. So I love Oxy Low Carbon Ventures. I am very hopeful that they will lead us into this next chapter. And I hope that Vicky Holub stays in a industry leadership position, because I think we need that kind of bravery.
Yeah, I agree. And again, it is so amazing the vitriol, I guess, that it comes up. And again, I think people forget, when the industry was in a decline, and I've been public about my ownership of CDEV and why, and obviously in hindsight 2020, if I knew oil was going to be 20, I obviously would have been short. I had been giving speeches for 6 months that everyone who listens to the podcast that has seen one knows. I said 95% of oil and gas companies are between 50 and 100% overvalued. Many are going bankrupt and must merge. And yet I didn't go short the industry because I was an optimist somehow that there was a relative value play and I could be part of like making, just have some positivity. And yet very clearly the answer was short oil, but that doesn't go forever. And I had said as a thesis that, as oil declined and as the American consumer and the religious fervor, because the US was growing like this, so it was easy to hate the industry going like this. And Bernie Sanders saying the billions of dollars fossil fuel profits, and everyone in the industry is like, we don't have any profits. We're the largest nonprofit in the world. And so my view was, as soon as you rolled over and people realized we didn't have energy independence and that we were going to need to import more and more and more crude from external sources, that was going to change the view of climate change, because natural gas is the correct source if you go to electric vehicles. And so oil would decline, we'd be importing more. The nation would be like, oh my goodness, we're importing all this from Middle Eastern countries and Russia, and but we have all this natural gas, and we can solve climate change, and let's go to an electric fleet. So that was my belief, and it was going to take 3 to 5 years. Now, so many people are blaming Saudi, blaming Russia, geopolitics, what's happening? Oil is negative 37. It's so public. What do you think is going to happen in the next 3 to 5 years as a result of that massive change in the last month?
Yeah, there's some really interesting macro forces at play. One is your belief, which I would have disagreed with 2 months ago, which is the idea of a reckoning. There will be a time when something happens and people say, oh, yes, we need oil and gas. It's mission critical, whether it's geopolitics or a natural disaster or something that will make us appreciate it. The evidence from my perspective for the last year is that reckoning will never occur. Our political identities are so strong that we will work against our own self-interests in order to stick to our identity, in this case, that we don't need oil and gas anymore, or they're evil. And that I can't even foresee a situation where it costs so much or you have blackouts, because we have those in California. And we have ridiculous energy prices, and there's no sign of a reckoning. Now, interesting. So that's one thing. Will there be a reckoning? I didn't think so. I still don't think so in a post-COVID world. How I think that's doubling down in COVID is the opponents of oil and gas are doing two things right now. One, they're saying, see, capitalism didn't work. The government should buy oil and gas resources and keep it in the ground. And so there's this interesting, everyone using COVID to say, see our point, see, we told you this doesn't work. And then the second part of that, which I think this will backfire in the long run, but our climate activists saying how we're living now is how we should live to address climate change. That's a perilous path, so go for it. Talk about it.
Yeah. I mean, 45 million. I would say that the U.S. is going to peak at 45 or 50 million unemployed.
Right. So that narrative. 100%. That dog will not hunt. And yet, what it tells us is how strongly one will take their view of the world and say, this situation supports my view of the world. And negative oil, it's really interesting. Of course, we only have a 24 hours of how are people reacting to that. But it's, see, we knew it. We knew we didn't need oil. See, a future's easy. While it's negative, we're done. We'll stop the clock right here. We'll never use oil again. Untethered from reality, but foreshadowing, I think, a mainstream belief that we won't ever return to life as it was before. And therefore, if fossil fuels is your concern, we will never return to using them again. So instead of fighting that narrative, I think our better bet is, yep, let's reinvent the future together. We'll be right there with you, because no one wants to actually give up anything for their decarbonized energy future. So we have to skillfully show a way to get there.
I did see a post this morning that was similar to your first comment on the see, capitalism doesn't work, and it to me it's so delinked to the economics of the world, and if we go full cycle to the whole climate change religion was like, economies don't matter, money grows on trees, clean carbon eating trees, as it turns out, and that we can spend all the money in the world to transition to this wonderful new utopia. And And then like COVID, the response, everyone's like, every life is so important. We cannot let one person die. And you're like, yeah, but actuarials actually calculate the value of a human life, and the price we're paying is absolutely nowhere near. Or the car example is 40,000 traffic fatalities happen a year, which you can stop by either A, banning cars, or B, putting a 5-mile-an-hour speed limit, neither of which allow an economy to actually work. So we accept 40,000 deaths. Historically, the flu, we have accepted 60,000 deaths as part of doing business. And yet right now it's like people have delinked economics, the climate change and COVID. We've delinked that the economy is the only thing that matters, because without an economy, there's no healthcare, there's no schools, there's no life, there's no organization, there's no society.
Yeah, and I think that the way we transcend that is not to engage it head on. Your perspective makes no sense, which is what we want to do, especially those of us who have science and data backgrounds and we want to argue. But instead to contemplate, the people that write some of these articles, which I say are untethered and nonsensical, they still woke up in the morning thinking and feeling that they were making the argument that would make the world better. And particularly around the healthcare and value of a life, it's very easy for there to be a very straight line to moral correctness.
Right.
And so in how we engage in the next chapter, I think there's two key things. One is a shared aspiration. We want the fewest people to get sick as possible, and we want the quickest path to prosperity and add on. And we want the next chapter of energy to be even better, even more affordable, even cleaner. And so shared aspiration is an easy way to transcend this bickering about my data or your data. And I will always say that for the oil and gas industry, science and data are almost always on our side, but that's irrelevant if no one can hear us and we can't transcend these arguments. And then the second piece, of course, is just respecting the way that the other feels grounded in righteousness.
Right.
And so we're talking to a shared righteous human with an ambition that we have more in common than not. And then we can say, okay, how do we deal with this? How do we address this? And our conversation today is amazing, because I expected we weren't going to agree on much, but really we do share so much ambition, share so much in the way we think. And although we might come to different conclusions, we can find steps that are a path forward together. And maybe that's a model for how we engage around COVID with people whose views are very different.
Well, in the energy world, and building on this concept that you're talking about, how did people who, and again, I think at the end of the day, everyone is trying to do the best. Like, no one was working oil and gas because we were trying to destroy the planet and make egregious profits, because quite frankly, those weren't happening. And so there's people on different sides who feel morally right, religious right. We have scientific people want to beat people over the head with data. We have how do we come together for this shared energy future to convince people to go with the moderate path? Because in Colorado, and you made a great point, is you feel like maybe Colorado's gone too far and it will continue to go too far, which just shuts down the whole. There's no common ground. How do we build a common ground with people to accept moderate, since their argument has been winning? And I'll digress 1 second. It's the mask thing. I did a post about a month ago that said, if the trade-off for us restarting the economy full bore today is that I have to wear a mask, which I disagree with, but if that's what I have to do to trade off, I will do that all day long. But then the answer is, no, we're not going to open the economy, but you're going to wear a mask. I'm like, that's not a trade-off. That's like, and so with energy, it feels like we're like, okay, we'll meet in the middle. And they're like, thank you for coming to the middle. Now we're going to regulate away all of this. And you're like, okay, well, how about we go here? Now we're going to go, and they keep going. How do we do that?
One of the advantages of no longer being the CEO of the Oil and Gas Association is that I am free to tell the industry what I think to be truth as an ally who believes in our necessity, longevity, and who passionately loves the people of this industry. I think the burden of bridging comes to us. the rules, I faced a long time ago that the rules are different. Media would never be fair. Activists can lie all day long, and yet we cannot make a tiny little error without it being broadcast forever. And we have the burden of actually producing things and having incidents and things like that. So the way I think about it is today, we're losing. We should look at risk. Is a hurricane off the coast? And we're going to prepare our facilities regardless if we believe it's coming on shore or not. And so I put the burden on us to transcend these divides, to always take the high road, and to know that we will never reach the 10% that's the extreme. But our audience is the public. Our audience is the 80% whose commitment to energy is just shallowly associated with their identity. And so that's why I think in this moment, post-COVID, even though economic survival is the number one priority of every CEO, publicly facing the priority has to be, we're here to lead you into the rebuild, into the next chapter. We are your ally, and we share your ambitions for the future.
And so how do you think we do that? Because again, I've heard a lot, and I think you touched on the difference between Vicky Hollub and the new CEO of BP, who sort of said, we're going to invest in all these other things that aren't oil and gas and move away from our core oil and gas business. But like energy, I mean, we need energy to manufacture things at the core. We use energy to transport ourselves and to manufacture things. And it seems like, does oil and gas need to do something to be deeper in the economy? Like start manufacturing products which are somewhat adjacent to our business, but not historically our core business. And I know that that's a really slippery economic argument, but like I look at Tesla, and like Tesla is able to be this religious company that sells 100,000 cars that is like at an all-time high, where it's not thinking about where the lithium comes from, where the electricity comes from, like who's going to have the money to buy their cars. And if I were Tesla, I'd be buying oil and gas companies because there's a tangible asset there, and then I could own the value chain and control the narrative. Does oil and gas need to go that way too, do you think?
I think the directional thinking that you're having is where our industry needs to go. And it's different for the different sizes and inputs of the company. So the international oil and gas majors are diversifying in ways that I think they have to. So when Total announced its capital cuts, it did not reduce any capital for its new energies business. And that's part of the message it sends, that we are recreating the future with you. I think that's mission critical. And I think actually our large independents in the US need to join that kind of conversation, particularly as they're reinventing, reimagining themselves, merging, totally reinventing what their world looks like coming out of this, articulating it in the way Total did, that we're here with you. We hear what you care about. We're taking this moment to pivot in the direction that you care about. For small private equity backed E&P midstream companies, this is really all going to be a matter of survival, and that pressure isn't going to trickle down to them. So directionally, I think the burden for reinventing where we go does fall to our large independents and even our large midstream companies, and certainly our downstream companies in the US. Where that goes, I don't know. I don't know that we even have to know, as long as we're engaged in leading the reinvention. I'll leave the sectors to you with the caveat that internationally, the need for oil and gas to transform agrarian economies into industrialized economies, that path is straightforward and absolutely required. There's no leapfrogging industrialization in an emerging economy. So there's a lot of future to be had out there. In North America, I think our next 10 years looks really different than today.
Right. So the ESG, because a lot, you mentioned the private equity, and I think a lot of ESG were having issues with LPs coming into COVID, where there was this big push for ESG, and it was very unclear as to which, they like to talk a lot about the E, but actually what they were focused on was the G. So they wrapped up a whole like executive pay is too high, the gap between the rich and the poor, even as a capitalist, like the salary range was egregious, and boards are generally not governing on behalf of shareholders. They're buddies of the management. So it felt to me like the ESG letter that BlackRock sent was really about the G, not about the E. What was your take on ESG pre-COVID and how that will impact a private equity company or it's these mid-sized guys who are just trying to survive?
Yeah, so ESG, the way that I saw it is fundamentally European movement moving to Canada and then the US. And we could track the activist activity around the international oil and gas majors, really pushing for fundamental change. And then BlackRock, which was also targeted by similar activists with very specific campaigns around climate. So BlackRock is naturally interested in governance, but the climate component, I think, was coming under direct pressure. I don't think any of that changes. BP's announcement of net carbon zero targets last week, right in the middle of the pandemic, tells us that they are still under activist and shareholder pressure. BlackRock now just got a contract to advise the European Union on their environmental rules for banks. So we're not going to see BlackRock go anywhere around the E. They have too much at stake in their own business to start being at the front lines of environment. So I think that foreshadows that the large independents in the US have 4 to 9 months. Once they get past the acute economic crisis they're facing, I think investors will be putting pressure back on the ESG component. And largely as a way to stay invested in oil and gas. The divest movement has become massive, $12 trillion divested. And for companies that know there's value to invest in oil and gas over the long haul, they need a way to discern between good actors and bad actors. So I think that pressure continues. I don't think it trickles down for more than a year to institutional investors, to private equity, to their portfolio companies. I think those companies get a break until consolidation and whatever happens in this chapter finishes.
Well, I mean, again, and I mentioned it on this, but when I had said, the 95% of companies were overvalued, and there was a lot of math and science as to why that was the case. And my fundamental point was my view was that they were using ESG as the excuse not to invest, but the real reason they couldn't invest was because there wasn't a value to the business. Because it's so tangible. We drill a well, you can forecast the cash flow, supply, demand, there's a model. Whereas a Tesla, or an Uber, or how about the WeWork business model being the worst business model in the history of ever in hindsight. But it could challenge a $47 billion valuation because there was nothing to anchor it. There was no physical model that you could say, no, like, look, this doesn't make sense. So I had always felt like ESG was cover for that. But I mean, you make some interesting points, which ties me back to your point right at the beginning about activists wake up. The activist wakes up to do the right thing, but most activists don't have Larry Fink's phone number. And so there's a coordinated effort of people with true money that are steering a narrative that led to the 12 trillion of divestment and that are using activists to advance an agenda. How does that happen? Because again, we can debate the man behind the curtain, but someone is pushing a mandate to do something that they will make money off of because they're making an investment.
Absolutely. So Silicon Valley, for example, is a known hotspot of philanthropy, that gears almost exclusively towards climate activism. So there's some nice work that's been done in Canada around US philanthropy money focused on activists that have targeted the oil sands in Canada. That
was Vivian Krause's work.
Exactly. Very well articulated. And I think that has parallels in the European climate movement. And those organizations have gotten really sophisticated and really effective. And what they do now is they make mini groups that target a specific company. So Shell has its own group of people that buy stock in Shell just to push a climate agenda as shareholders. And they have their own website and they do their own recruiting. And they facilitate the buying of shares. And BlackRock, similarly, an activist group created a mini group that just targeted BlackRock full time for well over a year. And this has more traction in Europe, and we've seen people gluing themselves to things. And the fact is it works. It's not that hard to target. And we saw the same thing in Colorado when there was one environmental organization that was generically anti-oil and gas, we duked it out at the Capitol. When every city that had their own Erie Rising, Longmont Roars, the Mead Movement, every little city, you only need one mom with a Facebook page and 8 people in their pajamas to go to a city council meeting, and you will be banned out of the city in no time. So activism has gotten super sophisticated, super effective.
So it's interesting, because I've obviously been thinking about the future of energy, and part of what I've told people is, the interesting thing about this downturn in energy is it's a downturn at the same time as the entire job market has been changed because everyone's shut down. Everyone is doing things different, and like the world will change somehow. And so energy people who I think are incredibly good with data, they work in a complex regulatory environment. They focus on human safety. They focus on a massive divergent group of people in an organization, in silos, not in silos, completion, drilling, geology, accounting, finance, and that then they have huge data comes in very quickly, and they have to make a decision at 2 a.m. about what to do to save lives and save economics. So I've sort of said, well, it would make sense for oil and gas people to use that background to A, move into other industries because they'd be really, really good, and B, go into government, because government is all of the things that oil and gas is training you for. But then when you talk about the activists and like they pick a thing and they mobilize with fear, and one mom with a Facebook page can like bring down a city and ban you. How does the politics of our country heal to a place where we can make really important decisions every day to fix our economy and still be mobilized by one mom and a Facebook page? And have that balance in a measured way.
The only thing that we can impact as individuals or as companies or even as an industry is our half of that equation. And we have not sat on the sidelines. We've participated in this polarization by doubling down on some of the things that people expect from us, which is even the things that we believe to be important, mobilizing at the Capitol with a rally for jobs. These make sense to us. These don't influence anyone in the public. So a big part of our work is internally as individuals to pivot to leadership, aspiration, empathy, making the connections where people want to work with us, to listen to us, to be a part of what we're doing. And I actually think everyone in the oil and gas industry, and I'm a huge fan of our millennial oil and gas workforce, should be engaging in civic life as volunteers, on boards, on city councils, on planning commissions, because the most influential person about oil and gas to anyone, polling shows again and again, is someone you know who works in the oil and gas industry. Will there always be unfair critiques of us? Will we always, you might get this, I always get, I'm a shill for the industry. And that's just, yeah, I'll be called a shill for the industry. I'll put it on my tombstone, and I will be a passionate, loving shill for the industry. But I would say I can work with people in Boulder. I can work with people in the environmental movement, and I can change minds by finding shared aspiration, by respecting what mobilizes people. And so I don't think our society heals with any air campaign on the benefit of oil and gas. I think our society heals because we are irresistible forces out in civic leadership.
And I think that ties back to your point in the middle, which is this has been great because it's like the most tied together conversation I've probably ever had. But the consolidation of industry beyond the financial means, and I had done a presentation to Oxy like literally 2 days before the Saudi announcement. And one of the points I was making was Oxy needs to be the face of Colorado because we can't have 10 companies fight 10 different groups with different agendas and different, goals. And our industry, unlike the auto industry, we have hundreds of companies and hundreds of private equity and thousands of diverse interests. But if we were 10 companies, all very big, all very coordinated, not with each other, but like Oxy owned every producing well in Colorado. So the only company that was dictating what oil and gas was doing to respond to that was Oxy, and Exxon in wherever. There seems to be, at this point, the fragmentation of industry has been one of the biggest failings of our ability to counteract this motion and this movement. Would you agree with that?
I think so, for different reasons, which is the industry is measured by its worst actor. So if you have one politically mobilized oil and gas funded group in Colorado that targets, for example, Democratic politicians, then the entire industry is painted with a partisan brush and as being underhanded in their engagement. And that can just be one person who maybe funded an effort like that. The whole industry gets painted with that. And we don't have enough solidarity that's positive. Our solidarity tends to be, and I say this as the former head of a trade, it's easy to mobilize the industry to fight. It's really challenging to mobilize the industry to lead, to transform, to connect. Now, we do that really well in natural disasters, which is why I want to see us do it really well in an economic crisis right now, in a health crisis. But that's the opportunity of consolidation. To your point, if you have a visionary leader who's willing to invent and lead into the future, rather than fight for our old position or our old market share, or why you should love us. We have to be leading to the next chapter.
Which does really pose a challenge, because these organizations have been built, especially the large, sizable ones. People have, the same reason people are afraid to comment on LinkedIn is they don't want their boss to read what they might think. So they've followed the political requirements and the mandate of that culture to get to the top of that organization. And none of the things that made them successful are visionary leadership, creativity, mobilizing for as opposed to against. And so it's an interesting dichotomy. It's the same as politics. Right. You can't move through the political sphere as an idealist, because you will get destroyed. And so we have created a system which creates a leader that looks like the thing that needed in the past, but to pivot to the leader of the future is extraordinarily difficult. And I think it's why some of these companies like Facebook or an Amazon or Google, they're born from nothing, and they respond to a crisis to become the thing that we needed for that time. And then as time goes by, they're no longer the same. They're not solving the problem that they used to solve, so that they become just like Exxon.
Well, and that's the opportunity of this moment, is our disruption could be so massive. Our turnover in leadership, which also has to happen, whether it's their fault or not, there's always that wave of leadership turnover after a crisis. Is this the moment that there can be a reinvention? And I am a massive fan of oil and gas's millennial workforce, who has been working their way impatiently up through the ranks. Is this the moment? And I argue, and will continue to argue in some work that we're doing at Adamantine, that this is the moment we bring millennials into our executive teams, into our forward future-looking teams, and let them tell us all the things we've gotten wrong so far. And I think we have a secret weapon that we are still leaving in the cube on the 7th floor, that we have the opportunity to bring into the boardroom, into the senior management team, and say, help us reinvent the future. This comes naturally to you. Tell us what's next.
I mean, I got to say it, and I said this when I started to get to know what Vicky did, and I said, I mean, I'm just I'm wowed. And I got to tell you, I'm wowed by you. I'm super impressed by the clarity of thought and the focus and the brilliance with which you tackled a lot of the issues we talked about today with no advance warning. You just sort of here we go. So, I mean, I got to tell you, I super enjoyed the conversation. I hope the listeners did as well. And Tisha, any final words or parting wisdom you'd like to share with the listeners?
Well, I'd like to thank you for being a firebrand. The next chapter requires totally new thinking, a willingness to give up the assumptions that we came into this crisis with, and you challenge our thinking. And I hope that your listeners will start the next moment asking themselves, what can I do differently? How can I lead into the future? So thanks for your leadership in this space.
Well, I appreciate it. So for those who don't know, which would be rare, but you can follow us on the web at www.hottakeoftheday.com. You can find all our old podcasts. We have added the video element because I do think it adds some a unique perspective when you can see people's faces. I wasn't for the YouTube before, but I got to tell you, I am embracing the future of video conferencing. So we're going to continue to do that. Until next time, be safe, be good, have a great week, and bye for now.